Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library Crowdcast Home, our virtual place on the internet where we do author and other events. So glad that you could be joining us here. I'm Janie Herman, and I do the public programming management for the public library in Princeton. And tonight we are really pleased to have an event with the Princeton University Press and one of their authors. The Princeton University Press is one of our big supporters, and we're always so glad when we can feature one of their authors on here. Before we get going, I have just a few little housekeeping notes for you. One is that if you're having any troubles right now, the chat is open and you can put it in there and I might be able to help you out. But you can also get audio and video help if you're having any problems. In the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see a little link there that says Get Audio Video Help. You'll also see that there's a button there, nice big green button that will take you directly to Labyrinth's page where you can purchase the book. It's available for those attending this broadcast for a 10% discount with the promo code Rosenhouse. You can, if you're local, pick it up in the store or for curbside pickup, or you can just call the store and ask for it to be available for you. And the only other thing is that there's an ability to ask questions. And so there was an ask a question button, put your questions in there, and you can also vote up other people's questions. And Jason will be taking questions at the end of this presentation. And finally, I will close down the chat for a good portion of the program so we can focus on the talk, but it will come back up at the end while we're doing the question and answer period. So that is all the housekeeping I have for now. And let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Jason Rosenhouse is a professor of mathematics at James Madison University. He grew up, though, here right in New Jersey, and where he was a prolific chess player, and he also attended Princeton High School, class of 1991. He then went on to get a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Brown University, and he also has an MA and a PhD in mathematics from Dartmouth College. His research focuses on algebraic graph theory as well as analytic number theory. He is the author of several books, including The Monty Hall Problem, The Remarkable Story of Math's Most Contentious Brain Teaser, and Among the Creationists, Dispatches from the Anti-Evolutionist Front Line. He is the co-author of Taking Sudoku Seriously and the co-editor of Mathematics of Various Entertaining Subjects, Volumes 1 through 3, also published by the University Press at Princeton. In addition, he is currently the editor of Mathematics Magazine, published by the Mathematical Association of America. And tonight he is here to tell us all about his most recent book, published by Princeton University Press, called Games for Your Mind. So let me bring him up on screen with us. Whoopsie, where did he go? I'm sorry. There we are. Okay. And whoops, let me turn your microphone on. Okay, welcome, Jason. We're so pleased to have you here tonight.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you who for coming this evening. I'll just take a moment here. I need to share my screen so you can see my slides. And yeah, let me just make that nice and big. Yeah, there we go. And yeah, so again, yeah, thank you all for coming. And I'll tell you a little bit about logic and logic puzzles and why I wrote this book. And hopefully we'll have a good time. So here we go. You know, logic, when you think about it, it's kind of a funny subject, right? Because in concrete situations, you know, in specific situations, it never really seems all that difficult, right? Like for example, if I were to tell you that all cats are mammals, and then I told you that all mammals are animals, right? I think you would pretty quickly conclude that all cats are animals. And that particular animal, by the way, is my cat Emily, showing the proper use for a shoebox. So I thought that was cute. And let's see. Well, here's another example. Rene Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." Now, of course, logic can't tell you whether or not that's true, but logic can tell you that that statement is equivalent to "I'm not, therefore I don't think." Okay, so this is logic for you. And none of this really seems all that complicated. And in fact, if we refer to John Venn, creator of the famous Venn diagrams, right? He wrote a book about logic in the late 1800s. And he said the following here. He said, "It may almost be doubted whether any human being, provided he had received a good general education, was ever seriously baffled in any problem, either in conduct or of thought, by what could strictly be called merely a logical difficulty. Do we ever fail to get at a conclusion from sheer inability to see our way through a train of merely logical reasoning? The collection of our data may be tedious, but the steps of inference from them are mostly very simple." And I think that's perhaps a little sarcastic, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, we all use logical reasoning all the time, every day. Every time you misplace your keys and you try to find them by retracing your steps. Of course, you're using deductive logic, to do that. And you say, well, I had the keys when I left the house, and then I visited locations A, B, and C, and I could only have left the keys at a location that I visited, so I should go back to A, B, and C and try to find the keys there. And of course, you never actually pause to spell out the logic of the situation, but that's precisely the point, right? You ascertain the logic of it so readily, and it just seems so obvious that this logic business just doesn't seem very difficult at all. Which is kind of funny, because if you actually pick up a modern textbook, say of mathematical logic, you're probably going to see something like this, okay? And you're going to see a lot of really incomprehensible symbols and a lot of gobbledygook. And this particular excerpt here comes from a book called Principia Mathematica by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, written in the early 1900s. And it's considered one of the foundational texts of mathematical logic, one of just the supreme achievements of this subject. And you might want to challenge yourself by trying to decide what it is that's actually being proved here. That DEM at the top stands for demonstration. And what is it exactly that they're actually proving with all of this? And to give you a hint, I will show you the very next sentence that appears right after this this piece of text here. And literally, this is verbatim. The very next sentence after this says, "From this proposition, it will follow, when arithmetical addition has been defined, that 1 + 1 = 2. And let me tell you, this appears hundreds of pages into the book. Okay, so apparently, 1 + 1 = 2 can be made to look pretty complicated if you truly spell out everything that's involved. And I can't help noticing, by the way, that this isn't even a complete proof. Apparently, we still need to define arithmetical addition, whatever they mean by that. So it sounds kind of strange, right? We have on the one hand, the basic logic of everyday situations never really seems very complicated. It never really seems like the kind of thing that you need special training in philosophy or mathematics to be able to do. And yet textbooks in logic look very much like this. And it requires some serious effort and some serious commitment to slog through it. And frankly, very often when you do, you're kind of disappointed at the end, because I know if I was trying to translate all of these symbols into plain English, I would be disappointed that the conclusion was just that 1 + 1 = 2. Okay. But there's another aspect to logic, which is that the very same people who would never want to take a class in the subject very often love logic when it's presented in an interesting way. How else to explain the success of Sudoku puzzles, which are just straight up logic puzzles? I mean, Sudoku now appears in most newspapers and in-flight magazines, and and books of Sudoku puzzles routinely sell well in bookstores. And but what is Sudoku if not a logic puzzle? It's just a straight up exercise in deductive logic. Probably how Sudoku works. You have to put each of the digits 1 through 9 in every row, column, and 3 by 3 block, and those initial starting digits are given information that you have, and then you have to reason from that given information to deduce what number goes in what cell. And if you've ever done a Sudoku puzzle, you know just how satisfying it is when you finally figure out that a certain number has to go in a certain cell. You really feel good about yourself when you accomplish that. And that's logic can really be fun. So you have this dichotomy that on the one hand it can be fun to reason your way to the solution of a problem, but it's not often a whole lot of fun to wade through a textbook in the subject. Incidentally, I would also mention the game Mastermind, which some of you might know. There's a picture of it that I casually swiped off the internet. And basically, the basic game is that you have a code maker and a code breaker, and the code maker chooses 4 of those colored pegs, and that constitutes its code, and those are assembled out of sight of the code breaker. The code breaker then has 10 tries to figure out what the code is, and after each guess, the code maker provides certain information about how close the guess was to the correct answer. And I have to admit, I have fond memories of this game because I used to play this with my father when I was quite young. And I believe my father is actually on this phone call. So hi, Dad. And I remember, I was fairly young and I found this very challenging. But I remember whenever I was the code maker and my father was the code breaker, he always got the right answer, and usually with multiple tries to spare. And he would then explain his reasoning to me, how he figured out what it was, guess by guess. And I remember just sitting there. I have fond memories of this, just sitting there, just entranced by this. And I have a clear memory of thinking, I want to be able to do that. Okay, that looked really cool and really sexy to me, and I wanted to learn how to do that. So, and Mastermind is still a big seller. You can play it freely online now, of course, as well. So you have these instances of people having fun with logic at the same time that textbook logic often doesn't seem like a whole lot of fun. Well, okay, so all of this talk about logic, whether it's textbook logic or Sudoku or whatever, it might make you wonder what exactly logic is. And funny thing, a lot of people have tried to define logic over the years, so I thought I'd share a few with you. James Thurber famously wrote, "Since it is possible to touch a clock without stopping it, it follows that one can start a clock without touching it. This is logic as I understand it." Lewis Carroll in Through the Looking Glass, I believe this was either Tweedledum or Tweedledee who says this. He says, if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be, but since it isn't, it ain't. He says that's logic. I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I think it's funny. Bertrand Russell famously said, logic is the subject in which nobody knows what one is talking about, nor whether what one is saying is true. And maybe my favorite comes from Ambrose Bierce in his Devil's Dictionary. He gave a fairly lengthy definition of logic. He said, logic, the art of thinking and reasoning in strict accordance with the limitations and incapacities of the human misunderstanding. It says the basis of logic is the syllogism, consisting of a major and a minor premise and a conclusion. Thus, 60 men can do a piece of work 60 times as quickly as one man. One man can dig a post hole in 60 seconds. Therefore, 60 men can dig a post hole in 1 second. Says this may be called the syllogism arithmetical, in which, by combining logic and mathematics, we obtain a double certainty and are twice blessed. And by the way, if you've never looked at Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary, that's another one that's really available online. If you're ever feeling a little down, just take a browse through it, because Bierce was very funny and a very good writer. Okay, now a little bit of bookkeeping before we get into the guts of the talk here. We should identify 3 basic types of logic that philosophers or mathematicians sometimes talk about. The first is so-called Aristotelian logic. In other words, logic the way Aristotle pioneered it, and we'll have more to say about that in a moment. But suffice it to say that his system of logic dealt with categorical syllogisms, which is really just a fancy way of saying arguments like that one I started with about all cats being, all cats are mammals and all mammals are animals, therefore all cats are animals. That's a categorical syllogism. Syllogism basically means an argument with 3 statements like that. And categorical means we're assigning objects to categories, like all cats are, all cats are mammals or whatnot. Okay, that's Aristotelian logic. And frankly, the formal study of logic kind of consisted of footnotes to Aristotle for a pretty good chunk of its history. We could also identify propositional logic, which is essentially an extension of Aristotelian logic, but it's the sort of logic that deals with connectives like and, or, not, and if then. Like if I make a statement of the form, if P, then Q. Okay, and you want to try to decide what are the truth conditions of such a statement. When is such a statement true, and when is such a statement false? That's propositional logic in a nutshell. And actually, that subject of how do you interpret a conditional statement, an if-then statement, you'd be surprised how complicated that can get. People write whole books on different approaches to those statements. And to a certain personality type, that's pretty fascinating. And then there's also mathematical logic. And mathematical logic is a little bit headier. It kind of deals with questions about truth and provability in so-called formal systems. And we won't say all that much about mathematical logic in this talk, so I won't belabor that here. But the big names, or at least the big pioneers in mathematical logic, were names like Boole and Frege and Russell. And mathematical logic is still a going concern among mathematicians to this day. So anyway, we'll be using these terms as we go along. So I wanted to say just a quick word about them. Okay, so let's start at the beginning with Aristotle. As with most, frankly, academic disciplines, probably Aristotle was the first one to write about it in a serious way. And he he wrote a series of 6 works, that are collectively considered to be his work in logic. And together, collectively, those 6 works are referred to as the organon, which means the tool. And they deal with various aspects of formal logic and deductive and inductive logic, and certain questions in the philosophy of language. But that part of his writing that was specifically about formal logic was known as the prior analytics. And I want to show you just a little excerpt. This is how Aristotle opens his book, this book that inaugurates the study of formal logic. Okay, he says, "We must first state the subject of our inquiry and the faculty to which it belongs. Its subject is demonstration, and the faculty that carries it out, demonstrative science. We must next define a premise, a term, and a syllogism, and the nature of a perfect and of an imperfect syllogism," and on he goes. And I have to say, as impressive as his work is, as a work of scholarship, as a work of literature, it leaves a little something to be desired. So while Aristotle, rightly gets the credit for inaugurating the study of formal logic, it appears he also inaugurated the tradition that logic textbooks should be very boring and unreadable. And let's see a little bit more of this. A premise then is a sentence affirming or denying one thing of another. This is either universal or particular or indefinite. By universal, I mean the statement that something belongs to all or none of something else. And I frankly defy you to read this prose without mentally doing that voice. Okay, I don't think it's possible. And you have to understand, it's page after page of this. I mean, he just goes on and on and on. And as I said, I mean, I don't mean to be too sarcastic. It's all very brilliant. But at the same time, it's he's incredibly tedious, and he has a tendency to belabor the obvious. See if you can really deduce. See if you can understand what Aristotle is trying to prove in this paragraph. And I think this can be enjoyed just as poetry, right? It says, first then, take a universal negative with the terms A and B. If no B is A, neither can any A be B. For if some A, say C, were B, it would not be true that no B is A, for C is a B. But if every B is A, then some A is B. For if no A were B, then no B could be A, but we assume that every B is A. Basically, he's basically considering considering statements like if you say no A's are B. And he's saying that's logically equivalent to no B's are A, right? Like if no cats are fish, that's equivalent to no fish or cats. Okay, and then he does the same thing here for what we call a particular statement, some A's or B's. Like if you say some A's or B's, then you can conclude from that some B's are A's. These are called the conversions of categorical statements, is the fancy terminology for this. But I really get a kick out of this because I think if you just have a basic facility for the language, it just seems kind of obvious that no A's or B's is equivalent to no B's or A's. That either one implies the other. But if that wasn't clear to you, it's a little hard for me to believe that anyone would suddenly understand that point by reading these proofs. And it's sort of an occupational hazard among I think writers of mathematics or maybe this is philosophy, in this case. And I don't think prose such as this has ever convinced anyone that these conversions were correct. And yet, as I said, it's page after page of this. Aristotle really loved this stuff. It's often said that Aristotle didn't really write books in the modern sense, even though that's how it's presented to us today. Really, these were really considered like sets of lecture notes that he presented to students, at his famous school. And if that's the case, I feel for his poor students who had to learn from such notes. Okay, but anyway, Aristotle has this kind of strange position. I've been having a little fun with Aristotle. He has this kind of strange position, in the history of Western thought, in that on the one hand, if you compare Aristotle to anything that came before him, he was such an advance over what anyone else was doing that he was really kind of amazing, in that sense. He found almost every branch of intellectual inquiry he had his fingers in. Everything, in philosophy and metaphysics, but also physics and biology and logic and rhetoric and politics. And his collected works amount to several thousand pages. And it's commonly thought that portion of his work that has survived is really only a small percentage of his total output, because there are references to other works of his that just don't seem to have survived to the present. So he certainly brought a level of seriousness and depth of thought that was such an advance from anything before him. On the other hand, a lot of his ideas just turned out to be wrong, and have now been abandoned. But Aristotelian philosophy kind of got integrated into the Catholic Church. As they rose to power, and so Aristotelian philosophy became very hard to dethrone. And this led Bertrand Russell in his book, The History of Western Philosophy, to issue a rather stern judgment. He says, I conclude that the Aristotelian doctrines with which we have been concerned in this chapter are wholly false, with the exception of the formal theory of the syllogism, which is unimportant. Any person in the present day who wishes to learn logic will be wasting his time if he reads Aristotle or any of his disciples. And then later, throughout modern times, practically every advance in science and logic or in philosophy has had to be made in the teeth of the opposition from Aristotle's disciples. So anyway, I just got to get a kick out of that. It seems a little harsh, but Russell could be a little caustic, sometimes. Funny thing, I mentioned Aristotle's work in the prior analytics, but he saw the 6 works collectively. He saw as essentially a complete treatise on the sum total of human reasoning, and he kind of set the stage for what logic was for several centuries afterward. To the point where, in the medieval times, a number of logicians, people like Peter Abelard was a big name, William of Ockham, you've probably heard of Occam's razor, that William of Ockham, and they wrote these very dense tomes that Aristotle would have been very proud of. You can now find these tomes mostly collecting dust in some of the darker corners of university libraries. But it led to something of a revolt. This hegemony of Aristotelian logic and the metaphysics that underlied it led to a bit of a revolt in the 1600s and the Renaissance. Here's John Milton. He says, universities present their young matriculated novices at first coming with the most intellective abstractions of logic and metaphysics, so that they, having but newly left those grammatic flats and shallows where they stuck unreasonably to learn a few words with lamentable construction, are now on the sudden transported under another climate to be tossed and turmoiled with their unballasted wits in fathomless and unquiet deeps of controversy, do for the most part grow into hatred and contempt of learning, mocked and deluded all this while with ragged notions and babblements, while they expected worthy and delightful knowledge. People don't write like that anymore, which is kind of a pity. I think the Old English spellings here make the sarcasm all the more biting. And I have to tell you, I think we absolutely must revive the word babblement, which just seems like an incredibly useful word, especially if you've been watching the news lately. And I just think that's definitely a word we need to revive. And incidentally, this was in the mid-1600s that John Milton wrote this. Around the same time, there was a logic textbook known generally as the Port Royal Logic, and this was another one of these long, dense books, very much in the Aristotelian tradition. But the authors were a little more sarcastic about things. They said, "This is what the philosophers have specially undertaken to accomplish, and in relation to which they have made such magnificent promises. If we may believe them, they will furnish us, in that part which is devoted to this purpose, and which they call logic, with a light capable of dispelling all the darkness of the mind. They correct all the errors of our thoughts, and they give us rules so sure that they conduct us infallibly to the truth, so necessary that without them it is impossible to know anything with complete certainty. These are the praises which they have themselves bestowed on their precepts. But if we consider what experience shows us of the use which these philosophers make of them, both in logic and other parts of philosophy, we shall have good grounds to suspect the truth of their promises." So anyway, that's just a little taste of both the Aristotelian tradition and then some of the revolt against it starting in the Renaissance. And if you understand that background, you can understand how what an amazing thing it was to realize that recreational logic could be a thing, right? In other words, logic just for fun. And that's exactly what Lewis Carroll accomplished in this is in the late 1800s. Now, of course, Lewis Carroll is more famous as the author of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. That's the main thing you remember for today. But of course, Lewis Carroll was actually his pen name, right? His real name was Charles Dodson, and he was quite a reputable mathematician in his day. Maybe not among the greats, but he was certainly a very competent and very serious mathematician. Made fundamental contributions in algebra and voting theory and things like that. But he also wrote this book in the late 1800s called The Game of Logic, and this was a book specifically directed at children. It was intended to present the principles of Aristotelian logic to children, and I find that hilarious because basically, where Aristotle saw a complete and systematic catalog of the entirety of human reasoning, Lewis Carroll saw a game suitable for children, and that makes me smile for some reason. So let me show you the game. This is Lewis Carroll's game. Okay, the game was this: he would give you two categorical premises, usually chosen for humorous effect. And the object of the game was to figure out what followed from those two statements. And here's an example that he used. if I tell you that no nice cakes are unwholesome and some new cakes are unwholesome, what do you conclude from that? Now, if you have some flair for categorical reasoning, maybe you can do this in your head, or maybe you can mentally work out what the Venn diagram would look like. But the cool thing is, Carroll didn't just present this and say, okay, go forth and figure out what follows. He had a very mechanical procedure, a specific method for how to do that. And the method involved a somewhat unusual sort of Venn diagram that looked like this. Okay, so you're probably familiar with Venn diagrams where we use circles to represent the sets. But of course, there's no reason why it has to be a circle. And for Carroll's purposes, it made more sense to use a rectangle. And he would have this diagram, and he called this a triliteral diagram. And basically what that means is that it's a diagram for representing relationships among three characteristics. So in general here, we have X, Y, and M. The idea is that having or not having X is represented by being above or below the horizontal line. And having or not having Y is represented by being to the left or the right of the center line. And then, having or not having M is represented by being inside or outside the inner square. Okay, so in this example, let's say that X represents niceness. In fact, let's go back for a moment, right? We see cakes can have any of three properties. They might be nice or not nice. They might be new or not new, or they might be wholesome or not wholesome. Okay, so let's just say X represents niceness, Y represents newness, and M represents wholesomeness. Then in this diagram, right, we could say, well, we have this premise that no nice cakes are unwholesome. Okay, well, nice cakes are in the top half of the diagram, the X part of the diagram. Unwholesome cakes are outside the inner square. So if there were any nice unwholesome cakes, they would be in regions 5 or 6. They would be in one of those two regions. But since we're told that there are no nice unwholesome cakes, Carroll suggested using a gray counter to represent that those regions are empty. Okay, and then the other one was some new cakes are unwholesome. Well, new cakes are on this side of the diagram, on the left side of the vertical line. Okay, unwholesome cakes again are outside the small square. So there are apparently new cakes that are unwholesome. They must be in either region 5 or region 7. Okay, but region 5 we already know is empty, and therefore these new unwholesome cakes must reside in region 7. Okay, so we now have a sort of a pictorial representation, a picture of both of these premises. And now Carroll suggested taking this diagram and translating it into the biliteral diagram. Notice we have now gotten rid of M, the middle term, the wholesomeness, and the fact that we have a red region here that says that there must be some Y's that are not X's, or some things are some not X's or Y. So in other words, in this case, that would translate to some new cakes are not nice, and that's what follows. Right? If we go back here, no nice cakes are unwholesome. Some new cakes are unwholesome. So the conclusion is some new cakes are not nice. Okay, and that's the game. Okay, and in his book, he gives several dozen examples. Many of them very humorous, involving if you've read Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, his kind of sense of humor. And so he has these very humorous categorical syllogisms, and you're supposed to work them out. You work them out by this formal procedure. Okay, now Carroll actually subsequently wrote a more comprehensive book called Symbolic Logic, and in that book he considers much more elaborate puzzles. In other words, like once you've done two categorical premises, you might as well try others. So here's one with several categorical propositions. Let's see if you can figure out what follows from this. Okay, so first we say all the policemen on this beat sup with our cook. No man with long hair can fail to be a poet. Amos Judd has never been in prison. Our cook's cousins all love cold mutton. None but policemen on this beat are poets. None but her cousins ever sup with our cook. And men with short hair have all been in prison. And then the question is what follows from that. I think if you read very carefully, you'll notice that the two items that only appear once each are Amos Judd and loving cold mutton. And if you care to work it out, and who wouldn't, it works out to be that Amos Judd loves cold mutton. And he has puzzles, Carroll has puzzles going up to like 40 and 50 premises. I mean, he was really into this. And but the point is that this wasn't completely frivolous, that his work in symbolic logic, I mean, yes, he's being very humorous here, but he also had a serious point to make, because it was actually a serious problem in logic in those days to say, like, how do you eliminate the extraneous, the extraneous terms in a categorical argument like this. In other words, can you devise a formal procedure for taking a set of premises like this and then eliminating all the repeated terms? And Carroll was really very innovative and very clever about that approach. He was a little bit unlucky because right after he wrote this work, the shift to mathematical logic occurred and Aristotelian logic kind of got left in the background. But Lewis Carroll was very inventive about this. He also wrote a couple of scholarly papers about logic, and it's interesting to note that those scholarly papers were published under his name, Lewis Carroll. In other words, usually his mathematical work was published under Charles Dodson, and then his children's literature and his poetry and whatnot was published under Lewis Carroll. But it's really telling that even a very serious work in logic, one that was directed at least in part towards other scholars, he used the Lewis Carroll name because he had hoped that that it would have some public appeal as well. And that's why he would often use these very silly, humorous puzzles to illustrate very important ideas in Aristotelian logic. Okay, now I have to tell you, when I first read The Game of Logic, okay, I thought it was pretty cool. I made triliteral and biliteral diagrams. I got out a bunch of pennies and nickels to use as counters, and I worked through about a dozen of his puzzles. And I thought it was really kind of fun, actually. I thought it was just very clever, his procedure for manipulating the counters. There's a lot more to it than what I described in my brief discussion. And sometimes there's some cleverness is involved in figuring out where the counters go. But I thought it's almost like a magic trick, watching the conclusion just appear. I mean, once you get the hang of his method, it's really a lot of fun. On the other hand, it is an occupational hazard for mathematicians to kind of overestimate how interesting their subject is for non-mathematically inclined people, and also to underestimate the difficulties that people sometimes experience. So I do feel obliged to share with you this actual review from a journal called Literary Review, and it was a short book review. I'll show this is the entire review. It was unsigned, and this particular reviewer did not care for Lewis Carroll's book. I'll just set this up by saying there are some references here to a character named Dr. Blymer and a Dombey Jr. These are references to the Charles Dickens novel Dombey and Son. And I think even if you have not read that particular novel, you'll be able to infer what kind of people these were from the review. So here we go. We confess to having spent some minutes in trying to make out just how children are to be persuaded to enjoy Mr. Lewis Carroll's new book, The Game of Logic, with its accompanying diagrams and red and gray wafers. There may be young people capable of being amused by such syllogisms as no old rabbits are greedy, some not greedy rabbits are black, all white rabbits are free from greediness, and by disposing X and Y, predicates, attributes, major and minor premises in order to, with a red wafer here and two gray wafers there. But we should be at a loss where to lay our hands upon such young people, outside of the establishment of the late well-known Dr. Blymer. We seem to see some pale little Dombey Jr. bending a puzzled brow over the book and trying to convince himself that it is fun and a game, and not hard work under a thin disguise. But a sturdy boy, not of the little Paul order and not educated by Dr. Blymer, would, we are inclined to think, spurn the game of logic as a stupid sham, black rabbits, greedy rabbits, pink pigs, and all, and clamor for some play that is really play, or else some study that is really study, on the principle that two things, each good in itself, often make when mixed a third thing, which is neither good nor desirable. Well, that seems a little bit harsh, but I like a good hatchet job as much as the next person, so I do get a kick out of the writing, even though I think he was a little bit harsh. Okay, so anyway, that was kind of an impressive achievement. That basically you had Aristotelian logic, which had some interest for scholars, and then Carroll not only came along and presented clever puzzles, but he had a pedagogical there was a pedagogical side to what he did as well. And I think that's really cool, this use of puzzles to illustrate, really important ideas in mathematics or philosophy or logic, whatever it is. Now let's skip ahead to 1931. And a fellow named Nelson Goodman, who was a prominent philosopher at the time, he published a version of the following puzzle. This is not word for word what he presented, but it's essentially the same. He imagined an island where there are two kinds of people, nobles and hunters, as he called them. And nobles only make true statements and hunters only make false statements. And you imagine that you meet three people, and you ask the first whether he's a noble or a hunter, but he kind of mumbles his reply, and you're not sure what he said. So you ask the second person what the first person said, and the second person replies, he said he was a hunter. And at this point, the third person jumps in and says, don't believe the second person, he's a hunter. And then the question is, what can you conclude? And I don't know if this was actually the first liar and truth teller puzzle. I think the puzzles at the store probably have a long history. but it's certainly one of the earlier examples. And this was published in a newspaper of the day, and it attracted an astonishing amount of mail from readers. So you can take a minute to try to solve it. But the key observation here is that no one can actually claim to be a hunter. Okay, that's the big thing you have to realize. And if we work out the logic of the situation, well, if a hunter said, "I am a hunter," well, then the hunter would be telling the truth. But that's against the rules of the game. Hunters aren't allowed to make true statements. So a hunter can never say, "I am a hunter," because he'd be telling the truth by doing so. And maybe you see the other side of the coin, right? A noble who said, "I am a hunter," would be lying. And nobles cannot lie. Okay, so neither one of these situations is possible. So the point is, no one can claim to be a hunter. But that pretty much solves the puzzle, because that means that the second man was lying. When the second man said, the first one said he was a hunter, he was lying. There's no way the first person said that. So the third man was therefore telling the truth and is a noble. So so there you go. There's a solution. And in this particular version of the puzzle, we cannot say anything about whether the first man is a noble or a hunter. Nelson Goodman's original version was a little bit more complicated than this, and it allowed, and his version actually was possible. But this was essentially the idea. Okay, well, these puzzles about liars and truth tellers were later taken to a high art by Raymond Smallion, who presented many of these puzzles, in his books. And his idea was to present the main ideas of propositional logic. In other words, propositional logic. How do you handle if-then statements? How do you handle and statements and or statements and not statements? That takes a little getting used to. And he wrote these a whole series of these books where he explored. He basically illustrated the principles of propositional logic through a series of puzzles. And it's sort of one of the themes, in my book that I call this empuzzlement. That when you take fairly staid and turgid textbook material and you present it in the form of a sequence of puzzles, I call that empuzzlement, and it makes for very engaging material. Let me give you a simple example of one of Raymond Smallion's puzzles. This time you meet two people, and each person is either a knight or a knave, with knights only making true statements and knaves only making false statements. And one of the people says, "At least one of us is a knave." And the question is, what can you conclude from that? Okay, at least one of us is a knave. Okay, well, let's see. Let's see. I guess the way to do this is you make some preliminary assumption, and you say, well, suppose the speaker is a knave. Okay, well, if he's a knave, then there really is at least one knave among them, right? You see that, right? If he's a knave, then there is at least one knave. But in that case, his statement would actually be true, right? In other words, right, he made the statement, "At least one of us is a knave," right? And if he is himself a knave, then there really is at least one knave, and that would imply a knave has told the truth, and that is not possible. Okay, so that means we know that the speaker has to be a knight. But if he's a knight, then his statement is true. And the only way his statement can now be true is for the second person to be a knave. Okay, so the only way to make this work is that the speaker is a knight and the other person is a knave. So that's kind of clever. Okay, and let's do another quick example of this. This time you actually meet three people who we'll call Anna, Beth, and Carl, and they make the following statements. Anna says, "Exactly one of us is a knave." And then Beth says, "Exactly two of us are knaves." And then Carl says, "All of us are knaves." And of course, the problem is to determine what we can conclude from this. And okay, so I'll just go through this a little bit quickly. And I think we want to start with Carl, right? Carl said, "All of us are knaves." Well, is there any possibility that a knight could have made that statement? I don't think so, right? Because if he's a knight, right, he certainly couldn't say all of us are knaves, right? Because if he's a knight, it's false, that all of them are knaves. So right off the bat, that we know Carl is a knave, and we also know that it's false that all of them are knaves. Okay, so either exactly one of them is a knave or exactly two of them are knaves. But now we move on to Anna and Beth. And we now know that exactly one of them must be telling the truth, right? They essentially contradict each other, which means no more than one of them can tell the truth. And we know at least one of them is telling the truth. So that means one of them is a knight and one of them is a knave. But think about what that means, right? That means we now know that there are exactly two knaves among the three people. Okay, so the solution is, so there really are exactly two knaves. So that means Anna and Carl are knaves because their statements are false, and Beth is a knight. Okay, so this has only been a very small taste of what Smallion did, and I've been focusing on propositional logic. But Smallion was himself a research mathematician, And he was a specialist in, in Gödel's famous theorems in mathematical logic, where these very famous, very deep results, discovered in the 1930s by Kurt Gödel, professor of Princeton University, I should point out. I guess technically he was at the Institute for Advanced Study, but maybe that's close enough. And Smallion was very ingenious about devising just knight and knave puzzles to illustrate these central ideas, these very deep ideas about provability and decidability, in formal systems. And I haven't chosen to spotlight that in this presentation just because it really does involve getting down in the weeds. But it's really fascinating stuff, and I definitely go into quite a bit of detail about that in the book. So when I talk about the history and future of logic puzzles, roughly what I have in mind is this. The ancient history of logic is Aristotelian logic, which deals with categorical syllogisms, and Lewis Carroll used his puzzles not just for recreational purposes, but also to illuminate subtle issues that arise. You can be surprised how intense Aristotelian logic can become. And then, then later we have propositional and mathematical logic, and Raymond Smallion empuzzled them as well. And there too, that one of the themes of the book is that it's surprisingly difficult to draw a clean line between when you're doing a puzzle, and when you're doing like research level mathematics. And I was a little surprised by that myself, because I had not expected to go in that direction when I started writing the book. I initially expected just sort of a light and frivolous collection of logic puzzles. So anyway, collectively, these 2 points, I use Carroll and Smallion as representative of the history of logic puzzles. So you might wonder what I mean by the future of logic puzzles. Well, the latest trend in logic is to speak of so-called non-classical logics. And that word logics there, plural, that probably has a very strange ring to it. My spell checker does not acknowledge that logics is a word. And I think most people would say that's ridiculous. I mean, logic is logic, right? I mean, if logic is not certain, what is, okay? And yet, nowadays it's very common for philosophers and mathematicians to speak of non-classical logics, and very often the attitude is that systems of logic are very much like systems of geometry, right? Like it used to be that we had Euclidean geometry, and that was it. That was just the truth. That was just the way the world is. Okay, but then of course in the 1800s, non-Euclidean logic became kind of a big deal, and people realized that actually when you're modeling, say, the large-scale structure of the universe, what you want is non-Euclidean logic, right? The universe as a whole is non-Euclidean, and in fact, non-Euclidean geometry, played a decisive role in Einstein's work on relativity. So nowadays, no one speaks of the one true geometry anymore, right? It's just that you have different systems of geometry. And the system that you use, different systems are useful at different purposes. Euclid's system is certainly useful for a lot of purposes. It's just not the end of the story. And logic is kind of like that. And nowadays, it's very common to countenance systems of logic that reject some of the fundamental principles of so-called classical logic. For example, maybe we want to have more truth values. Maybe it's too restricting to say everything has to be true or false, and that's it. Maybe you want to be able to say like neither true nor false. Maybe you want multiple truth values. There are systems of logic that reject fundamental principles like the law of the excluded middle or the law of non-contradiction. And increasingly, these somewhat exotic systems of non-classical logic are finding applications in places like data science, where you have computers have to deal with very large data sets, and very often there are contradictions in the data. And you don't want the computer to crash just because it has a contradiction. It's just because some of the later data contradicts earlier data. And this is a major area of research these days. I'm sure all of us remember that episode of Star Trek with the androids that are perfectly logical, and Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock eventually defeat them by presenting them with so many logical contradictions and paradoxes that their heads explode. Well, let's just say you don't want modern computers doing that every time they face a contradiction. So in the book, I use some puzzles, some knight-knave-like puzzles of my own devising to illustrate some of the ideas that arise in non-classical logic. And just what a strange world it can be. Okay, I do feel, I do feel compelled in a talk on logic puzzles. I do feel compelled to share with you two of the absolute classics of the genre. And the first is the so-called heaven-hell puzzle. The puzzle is you're in a room with two doors. One leads to heaven, the other to hell, because logicians are nothing if not very dramatic in their conclusions. We imagine that there are two guards, one of whom always tells the truth while the other always lies. Of course, you don't know which is which. You can ask one question of either of the guards, and after that, you have to make your choice. So the question is, what should you ask? And I really love this puzzle. This puzzle made, I think I learned this one in middle school. And this one made an impression on me because it really sounds impossible. If you've never seen this before, it's hard to imagine what you can do. Like, what are you going to do? You walk up to one of the guards and say, is this the door to heaven? And then maybe the guard says yes, or maybe the guard says no, but you don't know if he's lying or not. So how can you ask a question where whose answer is informative, regardless of who you're speaking to? And this puzzle is so famous, you might have seen it before. It showed up in a movie called Labyrinth, which I believe was in the 80s. A very young Jennifer Connelly, I think David Bowie, I believe, was in that movie. Jennifer Connelly has to solve this puzzle in the movie. And the trick is you ask either of the guards, which door would the other guard say is the door to heaven? And the idea is that the truth teller knows that the liar would point to the wrong door. Okay, so if you're addressing the truth teller, he'll point to the wrong door. He'll say the liar. He'll truthfully say the liar would point to the door to hell, and he'll point out to that door. But of course, the liar will do the reverse, right? The liar knows that the truth teller would point to the right door, but then he'll lie and point to the wrong door, right? So the point is, whatever when you ask this question, whoever you're talking to, whatever door they point to, you do the opposite. And I love that actually, because you almost feel like you're tricking them into giving you the answer. And actually, I have a section discussing this puzzle in the book because there are other variations and other clever little solutions to this. And anyway, I should mention that the famous three-guard version. Sorry if the resolution isn't really so great here. This comes from the cartoonist XKCD. And he says, over there we have the labyrinth guards. One always lies, one always tells the truth, and one stabs people who ask tricky questions. Okay, so I get a kick out of that. Okay, and we're kind of coming to the end here. I'll just quickly share with you a famous puzzle called the Muddy Children puzzle. This is a famous logic puzzle. We imagine that two young sisters are playing outside. We imagine that it had recently rained, meaning there was plenty of mud around, and as a result, each of the children had a spot of mud on her forehead. And we imagine that each can see the other's forehead, but not her own. Okay, and their mother, having a flair for logic puzzles, has them stand facing opposite each other, and she says to both of them, at least one of you has a spot of mud on your forehead. And then she says, well, now raise your hand if you know for certain that you have a spot on your forehead. Well, of course, neither girl raised her hand, right? Because each girl says, well, look, I'm looking at my sister. I see she has a spot on her forehead. So I didn't really learn anything. So I don't know if my own forehead has a spot on it. And so neither one raises their hand. And of course, no getting tricky. We'll assume that neither girl is allowed to feel her forehead for a spot of mud. There are no convenient mirrors. Okay, nothing like that. We have to do this by logic alone. Okay, so after a pause, their mother repeated the question. Says, okay, now raise your hands if you know for certain whether you have a spot. And the question is, what happened this time? Okay, and the really cool thing is that now, the second time the mother asked the question, each girl is going to raise her hand, right? Each girl now knows that they have a muddy spot. So what's the reasoning here? Well, the basic idea is that, like, at first you would think that the girls don't learn anything, right? But the key observation is that they don't learn anything directly from what their mother said, but they do learn something from seeing how their sister reacted to what their mother said. And the reasoning would go like this. Each girl reasons, well, if my forehead were clean, then my sister would not see a muddy spot. So when my mother said at least one of us has a muddy spot, she would know it had to be hers, right? It's not her sister's. I see a clean forehead in this reasoning, so it has to be my own, right? So if either sister is looking at a clean forehead, okay, then that sister would know that she does have a muddy spot on her forehead, and therefore would have raised her hand. So the fact that neither sister raised their hand tells the other one that actually they both have to have a muddy spot. And I really like that. And I have to admit, this is sort of it's kind of the simple version of this puzzle, but you can extend this logic to 3, 4, 5, literally any number. And you can imagine like 100 people facing this situation. And the logic of the situation is such that the first 99 times you ask the question, nothing happens. And then the 100th time, everyone raises their hand at once. And it's really very humorous to work your way through the logic of that situation. Okay, so at this point, I want to wrap this up. And I'll just close by going back to where I started, where I talked about this dichotomy that on the one hand, if you pick up a textbook on logic, it does not make for riveting reading. But on the other hand, people enjoy logic when it's presented in other forms. And I can't think of any better proof of that than the existence of a whole genre of literature based on the premise that logic is fun. And I'm talking now about what we usually call the classical detective story. And these are stories featuring people like Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, Ellery Queen, and and many other characters you could name. And they appear in a series of novels. And English professors might tend to sneer at this sort of literature, and they do so with good reason, because as much as I love these sorts of novels, it has to be admitted that you do not read novels like this for the penetrating social commentary. You don't read it for the searing, powerful characters or the convincing dialogue. In fact, pretty much, in fact, the literary faults of these novels kind of prove my point, right? Because as defective as they frequently were as works of literature, the reason they remain so popular is that they have this one transcendent virtue, which is that there's always that wonderful moment at the end where the detective recreates his reasoning about how he figured out who the guilty person was. And that's always so much fun, and it's just so satisfying to see logic wielded as a weapon in the fight against evil, that is just very satisfying. So I'd like to close this with an excerpt from a short story called The Problem of Cell 13, which my father, again, showed to me. I think I was in middle school when I first read it. It was published by a fellow named Jacques Futrelle in 1905. Futrelle had a second career as a journalist, but he also wrote detective stories. Sadly, he actually died on the Titanic. He went down with the Titanic in 1912. Anyway, he wrote a series of short stories about a character called the Thinking Machine, who was his real name was Professor SFX Van Dusen, and he was an actual logic professor. And I do need to give you a little bit of setup so you know the basic plot of the story here. The basic plot was that Professor Van Dusen, in the course of an academic argument with some friends, made a bet that he said to his friends, he said, lock me in any cell, in any prison, anywhere at any time, wearing only what's necessary, and I'll escape in a week. Okay, and he does this as part of a bet to show that the mind is the master of all things. There's no situation that the mind can't conquer. And this being a story, they quickly arranged to do this. Turns out one of the Thinking Machine's friends also knew the warden of the local prison, and they arranged to do it. And he does the bet. Okay, and they lock him in a cell, and he says he'll escape in a week. And the warden of the prison is the only one who knows that he's not a real criminal. Everyone else who works in the prison knows, everyone else who works in the prison believes he's a real convict. Okay, so that's the setup. Now, in this context, I really don't think it counts as a spoiler to tell you that the Thinking Machine does in fact make his escape. And that leads to this dialogue, and I'll close my talk with this little piece of dialogue that says, "How did you do it?" demanded the warden. The Thinking Machine has just escaped at this point. "How did you do it?" And he says, "Yeah, you gentlemen have an engagement to supper with me at 9:30," said the Thinking Machine. "But how did you do it?" insisted the warden. And the Thinking Machine says, "Don't ever think you can hold any man who can use his brain." And I just love that, right? I remember reading that, in middle school, kind of a nerdy kid who was more interested in math and chess than I was in sports, and that's quite a cri de coeur. Don't ever think you can hold any man who can use his brain, because I got to tell you, when they lock him in the cell at the start of that story, it really seems hopeless. And you just think, like, how on earth is he going to get out of that cell? And it's just so inspiring to have that much confidence in the power of the mind and the power of the ability to reason to overcome any problem. And I'll just mention this story, by the way, is freely available online. If you Google The Problem of Cell 13, you might have to hunt around a little bit, but you can find it. You'll also find it published in any anthology with a title like The World's Best Detective Stories or something like that. Okay, and with that, I think we come to the end. If any of this has whetted your appetite, I know a good book you can read, and I'm sure it's available in Labyrinth Books, which I know I always make a point of visiting every time I get back to Princeton. Of course, that was more in the before time, when people actually visited other people and went to other states. But anyway, I hope to be able to get to Princeton sometime again soon. Pay a visit to Labyrinth Books. I always find 5 or 6 or 10 things I absolutely must have. And of course, look forward to getting lunch at Hoagie Haven and a dessert at Thomas Sweet, and go to all my old stomping grounds from my high school days. And anyway, so that's it for me. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening. And that's it.
Okay, well, that was really, really fascinating, but we don't have anybody asking any questions yet. Maybe because you were covering so much ground in that talk. And I really liked how you tied in literature with the logic there, especially since this is a library event. And we certainly do have a lot of people in our library who are big fans of those types of mysteries, especially the Sherlock Holmes and so that's very interesting. Have you ever thought yourself about trying to do some kind of writing? I mean, I know you have an MA as well as your mathematics degrees. Have you ever thought yourself about trying to write, some short stories based on logic or?
I've had passing thoughts in that direction. I must say, I find writing fiction to be much harder than writing nonfiction. So I'm very impressed with authors who can do this. Yeah, maybe it's in the back of my mind, but I think for now I'll stick to nonfiction and just leave it at that.
Yeah. And so, are you working on another book right now?
I am, although not one to do with logic. I'm actually working on a second book about evolution and creationism, analyzing mathematical arguments, how they're used, how mathematics is used properly, in evolutionary biology, and how it's frequently abused by creation, intelligence, design proponents. Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays, unfortunately, we have, just on a daily basis, we have many examples of anti-science behavior. We were discussing before we started, about a lot of the response to COVID, and it seems a lot of people are ignoring what scientists are saying, and it's another matter. Anyway, evolution creationism is something I got interested in. I used to live in Kansas. I spent 3 years there, and I was working on issues in public education there, and that's where I developed my interest in this subject. But anyway, so what I'm working on, what the book will be about is kind of thinking about how to use mathematical models, good mathematical models in biology versus bad mathematical models, and also maybe confront a little pseudoscience that's all too prevalent these days.
Well, that sounds also very interesting. And yeah, the anti-science group in this country seems to be growing in some respects. Hopefully that's not true, but maybe they're just being more vocal than they used to be.
Yeah.
Well, so since we don't have any questions and we're actually coming up right on our full hour, it was a really, really great talk. I certainly learned a lot, and I really like that knight and knave. I'm going to have to go look that up. I think I would like to do some of those myself. Are there more examples of those in your book itself?
Oh yeah. I have about 100 pages or so of the book are about knight and knave puzzles and different aspects of them, and also some. I'm sorry. And also some of the deeper issues that they illuminate. Yeah, I was just I was just trying to kind of give a brief taste of it here. But yeah, I go into excruciating detail in the book. And yeah, that's kind of what the book is about. I should mention, by the way, since you mentioned literature, I actually have a chapter in the book discussing logic, the way logic is presented in literature. And I don't know, it's the last chapter in the book, and I hope people like it. When I handed in the manuscript to Princeton University Press, they send it out for peer review. And one of the reviewers said he really liked it, but the other reviewers kind of said he generally liked the book, but he criticized that chapter because he apparently had no interest in detective stories. But I figured I have spent so much of my life reading these stories that by gum, I wanted to get a little mileage out of it. And as I put it in the book.
That's great. Somebody, B. Wong wants to know, why do you think people are afraid of math?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? Because very often it's not just that people dislike math; is that you can get a physical response to it. I mean, I've seen this sometimes with students that it's a real. People call it math phobia or fear of math. It's hard to say. I think it's the same kind of fear that you have if you're suddenly like plunked down in a foreign country and you don't speak the language, and you just feel hopelessly lost. You're lost and you don't know what to do to make yourself unlost. And it's a different sort of confusion. Like a math class can often feel like it's just a foreign language. And I mentioned occupational hazards among mathematicians, and one of them is to just sort of forget just how weird the subject looks. Things, ways of speaking, ways of presenting, mathematical ideas that just kind of come naturally to mathematicians, seem kind of obvious, don't come naturally, to other people. And so I think this creates the sensation that you're in a foreign language class. And that's different from, say, like a history class or an English class. In a history class, I don't think you're ever hopelessly lost, right? Maybe you didn't do the homework and you don't really know what the teacher is talking about, or maybe you can't keep track of everything. But I don't think you're ever in a situation where you just literally don't understand the words that are coming out of the teacher's mouth. Okay, and in math that happens. And frankly, I'm sympathetic because I remember, going back to my Princeton high school days, where the foreign language classes were pretty intense. I don't know if any of my teachers are still there. I had people like Mr. Gonzaga, Mr. Bolzat. I don't know if these names mean anything to anyone listening. I remember this very well, but they would conduct their classes completely in the language. Okay, and this was very new to me. I remember feeling precisely that fear. That my freshman teacher, Mr. Gonzaga, would come at me and he would start talking directly at me in French, and I would feel like I had no idea what he was saying to me. And in that kind of situation, it's more than dislike. It's more than boredom. It's fear. It's, my God, I'm about to look stupid, right? And I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and then the follow-up question to that is the gender bias with, more females, it seems, avoiding math than males.
Yeah, that's a frustrating one. I do think the situation is much better than it used to be. Like, I know certainly at professional level math, if you go to like a big national conference, back in the days when big national conferences were a thing, hopefully they'll be coming back sometime soon. But I know just in my own career, I finished graduate school in 2000. So I kind of date my career starting there. But for as long as I've been going to these big conferences, it's pretty close to 50-50 women. And when you go to I don't have exact statistics at hand, but it's certainly nothing weird, to see women there. And it's even more encouraging when you go to the student events. These things, and you see sort of the next generation rising up, where frankly I wouldn't be surprised if it's majority women. Just my informal impression. And as for why is there this bias, unfortunately, I think it's just a manifestation of sexism and misogyny in general. That there are these cultural ideas that take hold. That somehow logical reasoning is for men. And just comes more naturally, and it's sort of, you get this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing, where culturally girls and women are discouraged from going into math, and then people point to statistics that say there are fewer women in girls in mathematics, and you get these very often these very asinine genetic arguments that somehow somehow it's genetical, and these are just very bad arguments, but it's. But it's hard to overturn them. It's because to really understand the genetics is not easy. Right? It's technical stuff, and it's so much easier when you can say, hey, some crackpot points to some paper that he doesn't understand and says, hey, this paper confirms what a lot of other people believed anyway. And it's a very frustrating thing because there's been a lot of there's been a lot of outreach over the years, trying to get more girls in math into girls and women into mathematics. And we're really seeing the fruits of that. Like, I think there are fewer cultural barriers than they used to be. And sure enough, big surprise, more girls and women pursue math than it used to be. So so I think it's just an unfortunate thing. I think it's just one. Don't barking. I think it's just a manifestation of sexism generally. But I do think the situation is improving. Yeah. My cat is being very quiet, right now. But she,
Okay. Well, yeah.
Okay.
So that was my dog Bandito joining in there for just a moment. Yeah. This is what we do in the times of COVID. We're working from home, and we just he was sleeping, and I was hoping he would stay asleep for the whole hour.
Anyway. That's fine.
Well, this has been such a delightful evening, and we're just past our hour, and we've had a great time here. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and everybody look for this book, and we'll be having it in the library collection if you live local and you want to check it out there. But really, more importantly, support Labyrinth Books. They are so important to our local economy. It's so important for a university town to have a bookstore like them, and we support them fully. And thank you for giving them such a lovely shout out. They're a really good partner of us, of the library, and so this is great. So thank you so much, and we're going to say goodnight now, and I'm going to close down the session, and we're just going to disappear as we do. So good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.